If you are an American today, you may not feel like your country is collapsing, but you almost certainly feel something heavier and more unsettling. Life feels tighter, less forgiving, less predictable. Price keep rising faster than ways. Housing feels permanently out of reach. Healthcare remains expensive, confusing, and fragile. And beneath all of it, there is a growing sense that the system is no longer able to protect ordinary people, but to many than the ordinary, those are Hans's spans. This is the backdrop against which the United States withdrew from the World Health Organization. On the surface, it looks like a foreign policy decision. In reality, it is something far more intimate. It is a signal about how power is exercised, how risk is treated, and who ultimately absorbs its consequences when leaders make unleaders bow out houses. Suppose frame the movement as strength that sovereignty, independent. They argue that America should not be bound by international institutions, that it should act freely, decisively, and on its own terms. But behind language lies a deeper and more dangerous pattern, the expansion of executive power at the expense of civic resilience and the quiet transfer of risk of the state to the individual. Abuse of power in modern democracy rarely looks dramatic. It does not arrive with tanks in the streets or constitutions torn apart overnight. It arrives quietly through speed, executive orders. Through citizens may faster than institutions can respond and citizens can understand. Over time, this speed becomes a habit, becomes a governing philosophy. A draw from Hugh fits this pattern perfectly. It bypasses long-term coordination in favor of immediate political messaging. It treats complex global risk as a matter of national pride. And it assumes that the United States can isolate itself from a world where health risks are inherently traditional. Piracy not respect borders. These are not recognize sovereignty. They move their appropriate rise migrant flows and global supply chains. Modern medicine itself is global. Pharmaceuticals rely on international inputs. Protected equipment is manufactured across continents. Data about outbreaks emerge first where outbreaks begin, not where political power is concentrated. Living global health coordinations not eliminate dependence. It simply makes the dependence less visible and more dangerous. It reduces early warning capacity. It weakens information sharing channels. And it increases the likelihood that when the next health crisis emerges, the United States will work later, not sooner. Time is the most valuable asset in a pandemic. Days matter. Weeks are decisive. A small delay in detection or coordination can translate into exponential spread. Hospitals are not called scraggly, they reach a tipping point and fail suddenly. When that happens, outcomes deteriorate rapidly and the damage becomes irreversible. Americans have lived through this before. They remember overwhelmed emergency rooms. They remember shortage of basic medical supplies. They remember fear, confusion, and political division spreading as fast as the virus itself. That memory has not just spared. It's just beneath the surface, ready to resurface with the next shock. Public trust already fragile, ears further under policies like this. Most people do not read policy documents or legal dispositions. They eat the signals. And the signal sent by withdrawal is clear to many citizens. Global cooperation is optional, and health security can be subordinated to political star. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. When just weakens, compliance weakens. People question guidance. They reject recommendations. They retreat from information ecosystems. In a health crisis, the problem changes not to efficient. It is level. The consequences stand far beyond public health. Pandemics are economic weapons, whether intentional or not. They destroy supply chains, halt production, destabilize labor markets, and strain public finances. Inflates follow churches. That follow emergency spending. And recovery becomes an event unequal. The people who suffer most are not policymakers or allies. They are renters facing rising housing costs. Workers who is bailed to keep pace with inflation. Families struggling with food prices. Individuals with inadequate insurance forced to choose backwind treatment and financial ruin. If weakened global coordination makes the future crisis even slightly worse, that marginal increase will translate into enormous railway vamis. Hundreds of billions in lost output, millions pushed closer to precarity, and a deeper sense that the system is stacked against ordinary people. This is why critics describe the policy not merely as misguided but as an abuse of power. Not because it breaks the law, but because it breaks balance. It centralizes authority while decentralizing consequences. It allows leaders to act decisively while insulating themselves from the fallout. Executive power spans most easily during periods of fear and uncertainty. Health crises provide ideal conditions for this expansion. Positions are framed as arrogant. Debate is portrayed as weakness. Opposition is dismissed as obstruction. Over time, this dynamic reshapes governance itself. Isolation ever often pairs with pattern narrative control at home. As external cooperation diminishes, internal messaging becomes more centralized. Compulsivity is slogans. Distance is reframed. and public disgust narrows. Foreign Americans, this creates a feeling of white powerlessness, not overt oppression, but systemic detachment. Decisions feel distant. Motivations feel political rather than practical. And the gap between leadership and lived experience widens. The most dangerous aspect of this trajectory is not any single decision, but the pattern it reveals, a pattern of individualism, and a pattern of institutional withdrawal, a pattern where strength is defined as acting alone if the deeper problem is not the World Health Organization ISIL. The deeper problem is what this decision reveals about how power is now exercised in the United States. Withdrawal from global institutions, not an isolated act. It is part of a broader shift toward governing through executive authority, speed, and confrontation rather than consensus, resilience, and institutional balance. Over time, the presidency has accumulated extraordinary power. Congress moves slowly. Cars reek after the fact. The executive branch, by contrast, can act immediately. In moments of uncertainty, speed feels like leadership, but speed while constraints slowly reshape the system. What begins as an exception becomes a norm. What begins as decision has become dominance. Health policy is especially vulnerable to this dynamic. Christ creates fear. Fear creates urgency. Urgency justifies bypassing deliberation. Once leaders discover that they can act unilaterally, what immediate pleasure costs, the temptation to do so grows. The witch hunt from hope follows a script. It avoids prolonged debate. It avoids shared responsibility. It avoids the friction that comes with multilateral cooperation. Instead, it consolidates control within a narrow decision-making circle while presenting the move as a defense of national autonomy. But autonomy at the top often means vulnerability at the bottom. When power is centralized, accountability becomes diffuse. If a health crisis part of control, blame will scatter. International organizations will be blamed for irrelevance. State governments will be blamed for incompetence. Citizens will be blamed for non-compliance. And the original decision-makers will claim that circumstances were unforeseeable. This is how modern governance failure works. No single actor is solely responsible, and yet everyone pays the price. Isolation also changed how information flows. Inside global institutions, data moves laterally. Windings circulate. Patterns are detected collectively. Outside host systems, information becomes filtered through national lenses. Signals are delayed. Interpretation becomes politicized. Bad news travels slower than good news because bad news carries political costs. This creates an illusion of control. Leader appear calm. Messing remains competent. But beneath the surface, uncertainty grows. When reality evenly breaks through, it does so violently. For ordinary Americans, this matters because information delay translates darkly into personal risk and derel. It means slower guidance, conflicting recommendations, regarded images instead of preventive runs, and confusion at the worst possible time. At the same time, domestic narrative become more tightly managed. When cooperation with external institutions decreases, internal messaging becomes more centralized. Complexity is simplified. Uncertainty is downplayed. Confidence is projected. These are not necessarily malicious. It is structural. Governments under pressure for recurrence over nuance. But nuance is exactly what citizens need to make informed decisions during crisis. As a result, people begin to feel manipulated rather than informed. That says that messaging is designed to maintain control rather than can be true. Just erodes further. Once trust is lost, it is almost impossible to rebuild during an emergency. Compliance becomes selective. Guidance becomes optional. And collective action breaks down. The economic dimension of this power shift is equally important. Health crises justify extraordinary fiscal measures. Emergency spending expands. Debt accumulates. Monetary policy becomes more aggressive. Inflationary pressure rise. These measures are often necessary in the short term. But when clause omissional prolonged, the economic costs compound. Inflation becomes embedded. Asset price disconnect from ways. Inequality widens. On scale, the burden falls disproportionately on those with the least protection. Wealthier Americans hedge against inflations. They own assets. They have flexibility. Low-income and middle-class Americans do not. Their wealth is tied to wage, rent, and basic consumption. A prolonged, poorly coordinated crisis as a silent attack on these groups. It erodes purchasing power. And it increases debt tensions. It deepens precarity. This is where abuse of power becomes visible not as repression but as neglect. The system continues to function, but only for those who can afford its failures. The irony is the policies framed as protecting sovereignty often restore autonomy for citizens. True autonomy means security, predictability, and access to reliable information. It means the ability to plan a fear while constant fear of systemic shock. When governance prioritize control over corporations, citizens lose their autonomy. Their lives become more reactive, and larvas like more exposed to decisions they cannot influence. There is also a geopolitical dimension that rarely reaches public debate. By withdrawing from global health leadership, the United States creates space for others to fail. Influence does not disappear when one echo leaves. It shifts. Countries that remain against shape standards, narratives, and networks build trust to accumulate soft power. Over time, this affects everything from social supply chains to scientific collaborations. American citizens may not feel this immediately, but long-term influence erosion translates into weaker negotiating positions, reduced access, and diminished mindful of average. That weakness eventually feeds back into domestic outcomes. What makes this trajectory especially onerous is self-reinforcing nature. Isolation breeds vulnerability. Vulnerability breeds fear. Fear for their concentration of power. And the cycle repeats. At its stage, citizens are told that fast measures are temporary, necessary, and protective. Yet each step normalizes a system where decisions are made faster, narrower, and farther from public oversight. The result is not dictatorship. It is something Monsanto and more corrosive. A democracy where participio is symbolic, where institutions exist but struggle to constrain, and where citizens sense that outcomes are predominant. This is why the withdrawal from who resonates so deeply. It is not about one organization. It is about the direction of governance, about whether the United States moves toward cooperation and resilience or toward isolation and control. For many Americans, the fear not that the country will collapse overnight. It is that it will slowly harden into a system that manages crisis poorly, distributes painfully, and asks citizens to act of risks they did not choose. And the most unsettling question remains unanswered: when the next crisis arose, will the system prioritize protecting people or protecting power? What ultimately breaks society is not catastrophe itself, but exhaustion. Not fear, but prolonged uncertainty. And not oppression, but the quiet realization that the system no longer responds to ordinary people. This the psychological cost of policies like this impose, and it is the cost less discussed, less measured, and less replied. For millions of Americans, daily life already feels like survival rather than progress. Bills are faster than paychecks. Rate rise while ownerships live further away. Healthcare remains one asset and away from financial disasters. Parents worry not about ambition, but stability. Young people delay families, homes, and futures. Older generations feel their savings eroded by forsaken control. In this environment, governance decisions that increase uncertainty hit harder than any can soften. When people sense that leaders are willing to gamble with systemic risk for political positioning, something fundamental shifts. That helps eyes way to vigilance, just dives way to suspicion. Persuasion gives way to withdrawal. This is how societies hollow out from within. The withdrawal from global health coordination becomes, in this context, not a policy debate, but a psychological signal. It tells citizens that even in matters of life and death, decisions can be made abruptly, unilaterally, and allowed thousands. It reinforces the feeling that safety is conditional, temporary, and negotiable. For the average American, this manifests quietly through long-term plans, more contingency thinking. Across the background entity that the next shock is coming and that when it does, institutions will scramble rather than protect. People apt, but adaptation, not resilience. It is endurance. And endurance has limits. When endurance wears thin, social cohesion fractures. Communities become less forgiving. Political discourse becomes harsher. Every crisis into pride throw a lens of blame rather than solidarity. People stop asking how to solve their problems tether and start asking who to show themselves from. This is the real danger of power exercised while restrained. It's not need to suppress dissent. It's symbolic creates conditions where dissent becomes inevitable and cooperation becomes impossible. Asterisk errors people disengage from collective responsibility. They stop believing that sacrifice will be shed-felly. They stop believing that come lives the protection. They stop believing that institutions act in good faith. In a fewer health crisis, this law is a belief is far more damaging than an logistical failure. Hospitals can be expanded. Supply chain can be rebuilt, but trust cannot be improvised in an emergency. When guidance is ignored, response fragments. When response fragments, outcomes worsen. When outcomes worsen, fear accelerates, and fear justifies even greater concentration of power. This is a feedback loop that transforms into crazy slowly without a single dramatic rupture. Fear is also a generational cost. Young Americans are growing up unaware defined by overlapping crises, financial instability, health uncertainty, political polarization, climate risk. Far than withdrawal from global cooperation does not feel like independence. It feels like abandonment, ideology string, and isolation. Peishi vulnerability disguised as confidence, and their perceptions shape how they engage with the country, the institutions, and their future. Some will disengage entirely. Others will radicalize. Many will simply read into private survival strategies focusing on personal resilience rather than public good. A side built on individual coping rather than collective trust is brittle. It functions until it doesn't, and when it breaks, it breaks unevenly. The cruel irony is that many of the people most supportive of electoral power believe it will protect them. I believe decision is equals safety, but power concentrated at the top really shields those at the bottom. It insulates decision makers while exposing everyone else. True protection comes from systems that distribute share information and absorb shocks collectively. From institutions that slow decisions when slowing down prevents catastrophe. From leadership that values resilience over spectacle. When Haswelli is over the place by speed, control, and confrontation, the result is not strength. It is fragility. History rarely announced turning points in advance. There are requirements later in hindsight when patterns become clear. When people realize that a series of small decisions reshape the trajectory of a nation. Withdrawal from global health cooperation may one day be remembered not as a bold stand but as part of a retreat from shared responsibility. Not as a defense of sovereignty but as a surrender of foresight. For ordinary Americans, the question is not ideological. It is practical. When the next crisis arises, will the system move fast enough to protect lives? Will information be transparent? Will guidance be trusted? Will supervision be shared fairly? Or will people once again be told to endure uncertainty, absorb losses, and data on their own? The most unsettling truth is that by the time these questions are answered, it will already be too late to change the decisions that shape them. This is instead case. Power assists while restraint always assumes it will have thanks to cars. History says otherwise. And when the consequences finally surface, they don't arrive as headlines or speeches. They arrive gradually in hospital waiting rooms, grocery aisles, workplaces, and homes. They arrive as stress, fatigue, debt, and grief. But the deep without institutions will feel distant. What remains is a simple brutalized engine system, just speed over safety, control over people, every reason and power over people. And the people will have to carry the weight.